Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Art and the Climate Crisis, Part of Shifting Tides, the digital festival exploring the intersection between art and climate activism. My name is Willow. I'm a member of the Almeida Young Producers. And just so you're aware, this event is being live captioned, and you can turn these on by pressing the CC button at the bottom of your screen. This event is a panel discussion, which is going to last an hour, and during the first 40 minutes or so, I'd like to cover some topics such as what climate activism in the arts looks like, and what responsibilities arts and artists have to make in making climate-focused work and shaping public opinion. And then during the last 20 minutes or so, I will be opening up to questions from the audience. So please do submit any questions you might have using the Q&A function below. And in a moment, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So perhaps you could briefly introduce yourself and telling us a little bit about your involvement in the climate emergency movement. But I think I'm just going to start in the way that my screen is laid up. So if we could start with Kay, please.
Hi everyone. I'm Kay Michael. Yeah, it's a funny one to say, what do I do? What is my art? Because it's that question has, the answer to that question has evolved and morphed and changed in the last few years in response to climate and ecological emergency. But I'm a trained theatre director, but I call myself, I'm a theatre maker, but I call myself now really a story collector or a people mobiliser, an activator of sorts. My journey with activism, with climate activism, I suppose, has been there in the background for maybe 6 or 7 years. I was the assistant director on Katie Mitchell's and Duncan Macmillan's 2071 at the Royal Court, which was like a major light bulb moment for me. It just switched me on to climate activism and showed me the urgency of the need for action. But then with the eruption of Extinction Rebellion at the end of 2018, that kind of changed things for good for me. I then really committed myself to the next 2 years to mobilising people and have been a coordinator for Extinction Rebellion in the area that I lived. And soon after that period, with others in the cultural sector, dreamt what it might mean for cultural organisations and artists to declare climate and ecological emergency in response to the many local councils that were declaring, and what that might mean to imagine ourselves as civic players and to really reimagine what the role of an artist in these times is. And so with Culture Declares Emergency, I've done a lot of kind of mobilising within that sector and being part of a new story, I think, that's emerging that we'll talk about today. But a campaign that I led within Culture Declares Emergency last year, which is still active, it's a campaign called Letters to the Earth. And that's where I'd say my role as a story collector or people connector has really come to the fore, where that has invited people around the world to write letters or creative responses to the emergency. And we've really connected voices from the global south, so those that are in the Philippines or in the Amazon, with young activists worldwide, with scientists, with politicians, with artists as well. So it's been quite an incredible thing to platform those many voices. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. April, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah, so I know Kay because I met Kay through Extinction Rebellion. Yeah, so I got involved with Extinction Rebellion sort of right at the beginning of the first rebellion. I went to a local meeting, and I think I did that because I think that in terms of the science about climate change, climate heating, it really feels like the volume has gone up in recent years, as if the crisis is so incipient in that I think that I sort of tuned in because of that in a way. Although I'd always been a member of Greenpeace, and World Wildlife Fund, things like that, but I'd never become active. So I went to a meeting, and I just was heard young people say things that really moved me about the fact that it was going to impact on them, and they didn't see themselves having a full lifespan in the way that I did. And I think just hearing 17-year-old schoolgirls say that to me, I just thought it was sort of really galvanizing. And then I became involved in Extinction Rebellion, and I wrote the first thing. We were looking for ways of kind of, how do you do kind of street art, street theatre, and I wrote a piece about Noah's flood, which we put on with actors. It was and it was my first attempt just to kind of, it was very sort of instinctive, well, how do you do anything? And I mean, it was the beginning of a bit of a journey, and just since then, apart from involvement with Extinction Rebellion, I'm just trying, I have commissions from theatres who've specifically asked me to write work about climate change, and that's a kind of quite complex complex ask and a great ask, but I'm thinking about that and trying to do that now. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Farah, if you could introduce yourself for us, please.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Farah Ahmed and I work at Julie's Bicycle. So we're an organisation that works with the arts sector as kind of a whole, across like theatre, music, dance, the whole shebang, on environmental sustainability. So right through from sort of measuring carbon footprints to like creative policy making, to leadership, to starting to do a few like commission pieces. So yeah, there's I joined JB about 3.5 years ago, and I think for me that was really the start of my personal environmental journey as well. Sort of, you know, I'd always been a vegetarian and engaged very politically, but I think that for me it was really about how the arts can help make things relate to your own lives, and I really wanted to be having these conversations about how, for me as a woman of colour, it related to me, and to bring all of those different stories and narratives of climate impacts and also climate solutions from people who we don't get to hear from. So that's what I've been doing the last couple of years. So as part of my role at JB, I produce a podcast called The Colour Green, which is artists and activists of colour who are talking about what climate change and nature and social justice means to them and how it all connects. And we're working on a massive program at the moment called Season for Change, which is about a huge sort of national movement from the arts sector, and part of that is commissions for people who we don't get to hear from in the environmental movement to create artwork around that. So yeah, that's me.
And finally, Fehinti.
Hi, my name is Fehinti Balogun. I was primarily an actor until about a year ago or 2 years ago, when my world sort of flipped itself on its head, and the definitions with which I held myself sort of changed. I became a theatre maker and a writer, and then I suppose an activist in the sense of being sort of an active and engaged citizen, which I'd never been encouraged to do before. How did that happen? Well, it happened because here's what happened. So I got a play. I was in a play. It was my first like lead play ever. It was sick. It was fine. It was good. And we were rehearsing outside, and I realised that all the grass was dead. And I found it very bizarre, and I said to my director, "Oh, isn't it weird how all the grass is dead?" And he was like, "Oh, darling, it's fine, blah, 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 let's get back into rehearsal." And I remember him going in and me just staring at it and just being like, "This is very strange." And then I Googled it, and I saw the whole, a picture of the whole of the UK, and the whole of the UK turned brown, like all the grass had died, and it happened all across Europe. And that year was the hottest year on record, after being the hottest year on record, after being the hottest year on record. And for the first time, I was actually seeing it and feeling it quite palpably. So again, I'm at this play, I'm a friggin' lead for the first time in the West End, and I'm having quite climate anxiety, which is something I'd never experienced before. So it's sweats in the middle of the night, waking up tired and confused, dreaming about being chased by icebergs. This is not an exaggeration. And then going into doing a play which is completely removed from this engagement with what's going on in the planet. So I tried to do a little thing of like approaching the catering team at the theatre and saying, well, can we switch from plastics to cans? Is that a thing we can do? I was ignored. And then I pushed a little harder and I was ignored again. And then I got another job and I went to a different theatre and I did the same thing. I said, can we push from plastics to cans? I think this is a really important thing. And I was ignored. And I didn't know what my power was in this situation. So again, I'm doing this amazing play and probably one of the best plays I've ever done. And I'm backstage and I'm reading an article which says, we've had more forest fires this year than we've had in the whole of history in the UK. And I'm like, well, what is the point of me doing this play if we're literally on fire? And that weekend, I booked to see an Extinction Rebellion talk, a Heading for Extinction talk. I'd never been involved with activism. I'd never been to a lecture. I've never really been doing anything with Extinction Rebellion at this point. So I go to this lecture and I'm sitting with a load of people, mostly white people. And it was the first time in my life I'd been around people that had felt the deep level of anxiety and worry from the science and the facts ever. And I came away from that and I was like, okay, sick. Well, obviously I'm part of XR now. And then got involved with them, helped with some of the accommodation stuff for the rebellion in Oxford Circus around London. And then I went and did another job. And being the sort of like perfect, what's the word? Contradiction of myself, I flew to the desert and did a film. That was great. It was fun. It was really fun. What can I say? I got back and I got into an argument with my mother. And my mother's argument was, why are you sacrificing your career to be involved with climate activism? Like, it doesn't make sense. Do you realize that you as a young black male going against an authority are more at risk than everyone else around you? We argued for about a month and then stopped sort of talking because it was just difficult. And our last argument, I recorded her argument, basically. I recorded her talking without her knowing, which was hilarious. Better to ask forgiveness than permission, right? So anyway, I took her words and I sat with them for a bit, and I remember sitting with my friend Elliot and talking about it. And it's just one of those things where you're talking to your parents, you're like, you just don't understand, you don't get me, la 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 la. And actually she makes some really good points. She makes some really salient points, really points that got to me. And I don't think I realized how much they did. So I took what she said and I turned it into a lecture. I adapted the Heading for Extinction lecture of what I knew, scrapped it apart and based it around my mum's voice and aimed it at people of colour. And I've been doing that for the last year or so, taking it around to different communities, talking about my mum all the time and about how climate crisis affects us, people of colour, in this country and around the world. And I've been adapting that into a play with Complicity. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thank you very much. Great. So, Fehinti and April, you sort of both touched on potentially specific moments that have brought you into climate activism. But a question for all of you, should art and artists in general take on a responsibility of informing the public about the climate crisis, or is that not everybody's responsibility? And sort of following on from that, not only informing, but also should we, through art, try to shape people's opinion? I don't know if anybody wants to go first on that.
I can go. Yeah, I think it is something that art and artists should take responsibility for. But I think with that responsibility, like, there's a whole other set of things. Like, I think that we should be informed as creatives, as artists, as the people who are putting that work out there. We should be aware of our space and the space that we're taking up in the world, and who else we might want to bring along with us and should be bringing along with us. And I think there's also a lot to be said about how we collaborate with other voices, with other communities. It shouldn't be just about artists, but actually you should be collaborating with scientists, collaborating with like community leaders and activists, and collaborating with policymakers, and making sure that it's as holistic and makes as much sense to people and their lived experiences as possible, because otherwise it's not gonna do anything. It's gonna be a bit of art that exists in a moment and then is fleeting.
Yeah, hearing what Farah just said, I completely agree. And to me, that speaks about, I kind of get a bit funny about the word responsibility, because my immediate response to that is, it's not our responsibility to have to do this work. I mean, it's just that everything else has failed. You know, the scientists, for whatever reason, their messaging hasn't got through to the point where we are, you know, we're at midnight or 1 minute past midnight in terms of the action that needs to be taken. Politics has failed. And so we artists are, I feel sometimes like, wow, we're left in this position now. But that comes with a great invitation to reimagine what our role is as artists. And that's exactly what Farah said there for me about our participatory capacities to work with, you know, civic institutions or policy makers or politicians and communities in our local area as well. Like, where has change really felt for you as an individual? For me, it's like in the place that I live in. It's the communities that I'm surrounded by. And I think, you know, we're at a really interesting time to also be having this conversation when theatres aren't open, right? Cultural convening spaces aren't open. So I think we've got a wonderful opportunity to also reimagine what is meant by convening and what is meant by bringing people together. Do we need to rely upon theatre buildings to be doing the storytelling or the work? You know, how else can we use our skills as artists and storytellers and creative producers to bring people together? And so I'm very interested in that. It's a much more maybe nimble and porous approach to what our role might be right now.
I just add that I don't think it's necessarily an either or thing. I mean, I just think, like personally, I mean, I've been doing a project with a group of people about landfills, a group of activists who've been very concerned about and the effect of climate change on landfills, and just that as a bad use of the environment. And so I've been working with them, as well as I have a commission from theatre that wants to work. Obviously, I mean, these, you know, as you know, theatre's closed down at the moment, and actually those conversations have slightly been attenuated. But I think, just as a person and a writer, you know, there's many ways in which you can work, and I don't think they preclude each other necessarily. Just add that.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything everybody has said in terms of being about community and working together and really getting into the roots of making change. I also think the art has a very, not necessarily a responsibility, but it has it's essentially magic. It has this incredible ability to make information understandable and emotional in a way that nothing else does. And like art in its many forms, not just theatre, but in film, in pictures, in storytelling, you know, because storytelling is exactly that, telling a story in its many forms. Has always formed society, has always been part of how fashion has been formed, of how we talk about language, of how we talk about other people, of the words we use for other people. We know that when politicians use certain words, especially words that define the other, a certain demographic will take that on as part of their lexicon. For instance, when Boris Johnson says letterboxes, and you're knocking people's doors and people are being described as having letterboxes instead of burqas, this is how language moves on. The arts forms language, it forms understanding. It's not necessarily a responsibility, it's a possibility, it's a power, it's a passion, it's galvanizing, and to be able to galvanize people. And what is also very interesting with the arts, especially now, is that these very complex ideals are needed to to be explained in order to come together. And what I mean by that is things like intersectionality, the idea that all movements against oppression are connected to each other, and that actually when you often are saying, oh, well, climate change isn't really my thing because I'm working on this thing, actually that thing is connected to climate change. Racial inequality, LGBTQ plus rights, all of these things, movements against oppression, are fighting against the same thing. They are symptoms of this one disease. And making those things connected is part of art's power, capability. So you could see it as a responsibility or a possibility. And I think it's probably more exciting than a lot of the theatre that we see, personally.
I think also, as well as it being a possibility, it's an invitation. I think art, there's two things, art and the capacity for us to tell stories that we can empathize with and that emotionally resonate and connect us to the stories, that they motivate us into action. But also it invites people to use, to use their own imagination. Like, we are at a point of crisis here, and one story that I would love to be told is outside of news, or outside of journalism and the scientific realm, is what does a 4-degree world look like? We are heading towards that according to the current policies that we're, the trajectory of business as usual. The government isn't meeting as many of our targets as we should be according to the Paris Agreement. We are heading for a 4-degree world, and there are some policy reports coming out next year that say we could, in fact, that could look like 5 degrees. But what does that look like? I think that's, for me, when we speak about responsibility, I do then feel a responsibility and a need to tell that story, because I also want to understand it. I want to know what that feels like and what living in that world will be like, so that we can then imagine new possibilities, so we can change that future or work towards something else. And so I think the stories that we tell are invitations to imagine, and to imagine better, and to imagine the story of restoration that is desperately needed to overcome the crisis.
I think I'd like to just sort of link back to what you were saying, Kay, and what you were saying, Fehinti. There's something really that needs to be done about how we talk about it, and the language that we use. Like, I've heard you talk about your mum before, Fehinti, and I always sort of grew up thinking that too, until I sort of became more involved and realized how connected all of those things were. And it wasn't that my family weren't talking about environmentalism, it was that they were talking about it in a completely different way. And when we talk about what that 4-degree world looks like, that is what my family are already dealing with in Kashmir. So it's not a case of I think, being invited to imagine a future, but I think there's part of it is like telling the story of what is already here, which is our future here in the global north, and making those connections really explicit and really honest, because I don't think that we've had much honesty in the whole way that this is connected up until now.
Yes, thank you.
Also, just to add on to Farah's point, like what you said earlier, who gets to tell those stories? Like, who is in the space to talk about those experiences? And I think when it comes to theatres, especially looking at lots of other productions, it's not very representative at all. And it is inherently part of the problem. The thing that perpetuates this everything else is that one of those things that we're not fighting as movements against oppression is, systematic racism, which is also part of the climate crisis. The idea that the global south, essentially people that don't look like you, doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't pertain to your immediate life right now, and therefore those stories aren't that important. Which in some points, people do feel like, I've talked to people that feel like, and it's really upsetting, but so is racism. So like, I think part of, and I think that is a responsibility. So maybe, maybe the question is, if you're not producing a piece of work to do something, what's the point?
Thank you. Yeah, touching on some really interesting points that I hoped would be in the part of this conversation. And you've all spoken about storytelling and the power of the imagination, but then Fehinti, sort of in the last point, you then started to talk about something I'd like to interrogate a little bit more, which is action. What does action look like? How do we translate art into action, or is it action in and of itself? And again, jumping off of that, again, not only individual action, but slightly larger corporational, governmental action, and how art can be effective in creating that sort of change. I suppose Kay and Farah, you both, from my understanding, are trying to work on larger like business and corporations. So maybe you'd like to start the conversation. Okay.
Oh, I was going to say, would Farah like to begin? Because I know that Julie's Bicycle have been doing this work for a much longer time than Culture Declares has.
I mean, so the way that Julie's Bicycle works is we sort of work across the whole spectrum. So, you know, with individual theatres, but you know, the way that we make the most impact is when we work with groups or consortiums or networks. And I think the most impactful thing in the UK has been our programme with the Arts Council England, which is the first of its kind anywhere in the world. And we started that 6-7 years, don't quote me on how long ago. But yeah, and it means that everyone who gets regular funding from the Arts Council, so all of the national portfolio organisations in England, have to report their carbon impacts to us using an online tool, and we compile that into a report every year. And what that means is we're able to collect, it's a huge amount of data. I think it's the biggest in the world in relation to the arts and cultural sector. And it means that, you know, we're able to go to policymakers and say, like, look at these, look at the figures, look at the cost savings, look at the energy savings. But as well as that, just the act of having to go online and type all of this in and put it in has meant that people are actually looking at their bills and saying, well, why are we doing this? Like, this doesn't work, and having to think about the way that they run their businesses and their organizations in a completely different way. So alongside that, so it's not just about the numbers. I think, you know, carbon footprints and stats and data tell a story, but it's not the full story. So what we do along the way is a series of training programs, is guides and reports and fact sheets, so people can understand the numbers that they're looking at and understand what to do about it. So yeah, we have like a huge amount of engagement from people, which is world leading.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing what Julie's Bicycle have been doing for some time, and Culture Declares Emergency, you know, really works alongside what Julie's Bicycle has been doing, and really, you know, signposts. There's lots of kind of sharing within the networks, but also I think the Culture Declares Emergency sits within this liminal space between the more organizational change making that Julie's Bicycle has predominantly focused on, and then the kind of radical action of something like Extinction Rebellion. And Culture Declares was born out of that radical mobilizing player of XR. Many of us who came together to dream of what it would mean for culture to declare emergency came from and met each other through XR. And so it's a very simple, very clear invitation for cultural organisations, but also very importantly individuals, so individual artists. So those, you know, when we talk about organisations, we're not limiting that to NPOs. It's a broad range of cultural players, from dance artists and writers, and even well-being practitioners, as well as theatre practitioners and museums and galleries, for example. And it's through Culture Declares, it's the invitation to declare emergency. So the first demand is to tell the truth and to take that responsibility, that recognizing that we're in an emergency, and what is it to communicate that emergency with our audiences, with the people that we work with, and with government or policy or those that we might receive funding from. and the second thing that follows is the action that we then take as individuals or as organizations, and that's really open. You know, people Culture Declares provides a network or a movement for people to come together across that broad range of culture to talk and to like share, you know, their grief as well as their dreams and visions for the future. And what is seeded in that is really remarkable. And there is still that radical edge to Culture Declares Emergency, where, you know, we have working groups that are now working on strategic change making and disruptive actions and events that not only bring our cultural declarers together, but also bring about change in the public sphere, whether that's in you know, the real world or online now, or both. And how do we continue to amplify all of the stories of those cultural players who are making change, that we're inspiring each other and our audiences and like beyond the sector. And so something that Culture Declares Emergency has inspired in other sectors are other sectors to also declare emergency. So we have architects declare emergency, there's music declares emergency, tourism, business, so many others. And now we're looking at how all these sectors working together for a shared story of change and for a shared vision of the future. And so it's a real lever for power, actually. It's a real platform and from which we can speak directly to power. And so if there are any of you out there that want to join, please do. Yes, I can't quite remember your question, Willow, but I think that gives a bit of a brief summary of where we are and what we're doing. But you know, we're looking ahead to, and everyone, if maybe if you were here in yesterday's panel, you might have heard that there's a rebellion coming up in September. So that's what XR are leading on. And so we're currently looking at, well, what is Culture Declares' strategic response to that? And what's the invitation for artists and cultural players to respond to that moment, but also thinking about COP, the climate summit coming up, that's been postponed to 2021. But just importantly to note also that, you know, with organizations declaring emergency, that's not necessarily an easy process or easy thing, where you have organizations that have to report to their boards or, you know, are very accountable with the funding that they receive as well. But that's where the work, I think, and this is where we go back to Julie's bicycle, that's where like the deep structural work happens to make change. But, you know, we're really advocating for just changing the whole story of what it means to be an artist in these times. And I think that has really caught the imagination. And I think that is what it's doing that's slightly different to Julie's bicycle as well.
Thank you, Kate. So in terms of organisations being able to change the stories they're telling, I'm curious how individually, how you choose which stories you want to tell. So April, you were a playwright, you wrote Mrs. Noah, that was in Parliament Square last year. How did you choose upon that story or any other stories that you want to put out into the world?
I think it's interesting talking about demonstrations and kind of activism, because I think what's happened to me is that since Mrs. Noah, because I've got to know the Earth Ensemble, which are a group of actors and theatre makers that got together to try and make work for protests, is I then became available for things. And so, for example, we did a protest outside an aviation conference, which was in Islington, and we wrote, you know, I wrote a piece of some act. It was all about kind of a kind of challenge to the conference. And what was really interesting, we had, you know, designers working with us, we were musicians, and we did this piece of theatre. And there was what I did notice that was interesting was that it's sort of untouchable when people are performing like that. The kind of the security guards stood back, people kind of nobody could kind of break into that circle, and it had this sort of really transformative effect. It was as if, and then lots of people did kind of stop and talk to us, and there were leaflets being handed out for a couple of days after the performance as well. But it was as if there was some sort of magic sort of barrier around us that we couldn't be just sort of bustled away or pushed away. And I don't know what it is about performance that has this kind of, it's almost some kind of magic about it that happens. So I suppose I have then done various other things. We did a protest rewriting the words to Carmen's opera, because the opera Carmen was funded by BP, and we went round to the whole massive act. We walked around to all the kind to 5 locations, secret locations of offices of oil companies in London, and we addressed them with a speech that I wrote with a brilliant actress who'd had an amazing dress design for her, and so there's a kind of and we were all wearing black as a kind of funeral for the, you know, but again, it has this sort of, it's more impactful. It's very, I'm very interested about how impactful those sort of moments are, within those encounters are. And then the Financial Times covered it, and it's sort of, somebody got in touch with me and said, oh look, they've quoted from our speech in this article. And so it seems like, how can it have an impact? But it sort of does, and I think that's a very interesting. I don't know, I found that, just from, I'm only speaking from my own experience, but I find that, and also that your role is then for people to kind of, to work and collaborate with others to make something, which I think is a very useful way of using your role, the skills you might have learned over your lifetime as an artist, a writer. Yeah, so that's one answer. Is that enough?
Thank you. No, super interesting to hear of your examples of actual art that has been created. And speaking about collaboration and who is making that art, and it's something that Fehinti touched on earlier, I'd like to ask Farah, because your work is so tied to social, racial and climate justice, mainstream climate activism in this country has been noted to be pretty white. Is this exacerbated by the whiteness of the art world when trying to produce art in response to or to illuminate the climate crisis?
Absolutely. You know, the arts and the environmental sector are both, in terms of who gets employed in those sectors, incredibly white, you know, and because we do like to see ourselves as, you know, liberal and open-minded and all the rest of it, it's really easy to gloss over that. You know, the environmental sector is doing something good for the world. So within that, like, those sorts of practices aren't challenged or confronted or engaged with in the way that they should be. And you know, it does exacerbate it, because it leads to this feedback loop of, again, what's important, what stories are important, like who should we be hearing from, who deserves to lead something, you know, and I think that art should never be bestowed upon a community. It should always be, if it's something that's really participatory, it should be led by those people who are affected. It should be them, like, out the front. It's not sort of people going in and saying, well, this is what's important to you. And I think that I personally have seen a fair amount of that from the arts and from the environmental sector. And you know, I think it does exacerbate it, because it makes it feel really unwelcome, and it makes you feel like you don't have anything to add to it. But I think, you know, something that made sense to me quite recently was, you know, hearing or finding out about the history of the word tree hugger. And it's from Kashmiri Hindu tribes from a couple of centuries ago, who would chain themselves to trees as a protest against those trees being cut down by colonial forces. And that's my history. That's my lineage. So it was really powerful hearing that, because that made sense to me. I could understand how it all fit together in this, like, anti-colonial revolution, in this, like, this actual way of imagining a world that exists outside of the structures that you know, those people, my ancestors, were living in. You know, so when we think about ways of imagining and challenging these systems, like, my ancestors have been doing it for a long time, Fehinti's ancestors have been doing it for a long time. We've fought back consistently and powerfully throughout history, and that should be part of the solutions that we're seeing in the stories that we're telling now.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Oh, I smashed it. It's pretty good.
So then, you were speaking in your introduction, Fehinti, about reflecting on your personal experiences and your cultural experiences. And as you mentioned, the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect the global south. Could you expand further on how you reflect this in your work?
So I didn't quite hear you. Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
So the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect the global south.
Yeah.
Could you expand further on how you reflect this in your work?
Yeah. Representation is really important, because actually, so for instance, as Farah was saying, this sort of like prediction of where the UK will be in however many years is where certain areas of the world have been for the last 20, 30 years. And what's interesting about that is we have descendants of those people in this country, British citizens, British people who have descendancy all over Asia, all over Africa, on the Caribbean islands. Now, here's the thing. Those people are often activists without even knowing, because what they do is they make their paycheck and then they send that paycheck home. And what does that money go to? That money goes to rebuilding houses. That money goes to getting food. That money goes to getting water. All this climate activism that we do by giving our money to Greenpeace or so is the things that people have been doing in this country for generations already. Now that's a story that needs to be told, and that can only come through representation. In a book, Hope in the Dark, it says, if we knew how much we'd achieved, how much we have to achieve wouldn't seem so far. And often part of the sort of thing that breaks down our hope is an erasure of history. We don't hear about Ken Saro-Wiwa and leading the biggest civil disobedience movement in the world, which happened in Nigeria. We don't hear about a litany of activists of colour. We don't hear about anti-capitalist ways of working that have existed and thrived within this country all over the world. That's part of an erasure of activism which disempowers us. So how do we get that back? Well, we tell those stories. We say that you are not singular, that you don't start this activism by yourself. I know personally, I have felt like I am the only person who looks like me, comes from a background I do, who cares about the things that I do. Now, that's a lie. That's a lie that I've been taught for the convenience of other people because my society does not reward anything that goes against it. It's a lie, it's a fallacy. So when I start to learn about my history, the bibliography of people that look like me, I start to feel empowered and galvanized. And I'm trying to put that into my work by putting by putting myself out there as someone who cares for this thing and is fighting for this thing, and also has a history going back generations of people fighting this thing. You can too. Not only can you do it, but you can succeed and be praised for it within your community, within your own life. And I think that sort of work goes back to the question of who's telling these stories, what things are important, what theatres are doing this. I mean, let's not lie, before the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of theatres just didn't care. Why is it all of a sudden now the white gaze is on it that those problems are now given legitimacy? Do you know what I mean? And why is it the global South's problems are now given legitimacy? They've existed for a long, long time. How do we change this narrative where the base function is, okay, does it affect a European white person? And that's where we'll go from movements. And that doesn't work. It's the same way that we praise patriarchy. We don't really praise it, but we live in a way that we think, well, if you're a feminist, it's not going to affect you as a man. But actually, patriarchy gets us as men worse than anyone else. It's part of this self-fulfilling narrative, and breaking these things and telling these stories is part of the work that I try and produce, I hope.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we've only got sort of just under a quarter of an hour left, so I think I'll move on to some of the questions that have come through. And if you do have any questions, please submit them. And I think I will start with going back to what we spoke about at the start. Penny has asked, on the topic of artists' responsibility in responding to the climate crisis, don't we have to accept some responsibility for the fact that the creative industries have been promoting unsustainable narratives and systems for many years? Have we always been the good guys here?
Sorry, do you mind repeating that, Willow, if that's possible?
So, on the topic of artists' responsibility in responding to the climate crisis, don't we have to accept some responsibility for the fact that the creative industries themselves have been promoting unsustainable narratives and systems for many years. Have we always been the good guy?
Unsustainable narratives
and systems.
And systems. Yeah, I mean, there's much that can be criticised of XR, and rightly so, and Fehinti actually illuminates some of that in what he's just said. But something that I really value are some of the principles and values that it operates by, and one of them is that we do not blame or shame, and that's quite an interesting one. When you've, you know, we're talking about just here, you know, some creative industries and organisations have not led well in terms of their practices or even the cultural programming. Yeah, and this is where Culture Declares Emergency sits in as a slightly different sphere than XR's, to say we're going to work with these organisations to unlearn and then learn together. You know, this is a great period of unlearning and learning, I think. And we will only achieve the change that's needed if we do that together. That's my little answer on that. Someone else might have more to say.
Well, I mean, in some ways, you know, I always think of the arts tend to be, you know, thinking, you know, for example, joined theatre, got involved because I was a feminist, and I joined feminist theatre. And in the sense that, you know, we talked about patriarchy, trying to challenge those patriarchal forms, which also are embedded in capitalism, which also are embedded in extractive practices, colonial practices, you know, that in some ways, I always feel that, you know, certainly the companies I started off with, small women's companies, they were always engaged in this. If you open it out, that sense that art is good art, I think, is trying to be radical and challenge entrenched power structures. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, like who are you talking about? Because I think responsibility is really important for moving forward, and I say that because we're at a point of change. We're in COVID. We're essentially coming out or regrowing in a way that, in some forms, is quite practically trying to get back to business as usual. Is trying to go back to this thing that has worked and is a patriarchal capitalist structure that is at its heart perfunctory at best. And let's be honest, a lot of these companies we know really, really well. So I think in answering that question, or to go on April's comment, there are companies at the heart which started off in like being feminist and anti-capitalist and against the patriarchy, but whilst living in a world that doesn't reward those things, became something else ever so slowly. And we have these big institutions that we love, like the Almeida, that have had less than rewardable practices in sustainability and in trying to get rid of these fundamental things we need to get rid of. And I think acknowledging that and actually really calling it out is the best way to move forward, as well as what Culture Declares is doing, which is working with it and saying, how can you move on from there? But calling that shit out is like really important, and being able to be like, yeah, I fucked up. Fundamentally, and actually fundamentally how this company is run is wrong, and that is of most companies, because how often do you walk away from a rehearsal room or an experience in a company and go, wow, that was amazing, like I felt nourished, I felt like they understood what I was doing, I felt like this was really going towards somewhere. And when you do have those experiences, you go, well, that was rare, wasn't it? That doesn't happen all the time. So essentially giving evidence to the fact that fundamentally most of these things are wrong and corrupt. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just like to add that there's a separation to be made between the creative industries and individuals within that, because we are existing in this you know, hyper-capitalist, very extractive system. But there's always somebody in those spaces trying to change things. Unfortunately, those individuals are usually the people who are the most burnt out by it, who are exhausted by it. And I think that no, you're absolutely right. The creative industries has been guilty of engaging in unsustainable narratives and systems for a long time. Like the industry itself is not necessarily the good guy, but it's up to us to find and support those people within it and change it. I think not just change it from the inside, but actually dismantle it. Like support those people to really completely do away with those structures and rethink what the industry should be. And there's people who, as was mentioned before, who don't call themselves artists, who are fully leading the way in what amazing creative activism is and can be and should look like.
Yeah,
they just don't get any money.
I love what you're saying, Farah, and for me that is the art of our times. That's the art. It's not a product, it's not something to make, it's a process, it's a process to live by.
Amazing, thank you. Super powerful from each of you. I'm conscious we've only got about 5 minutes left, and following on from that, could we potentially talk about any advice you might have? This is a festival for young people, and how can young people go about having these conversations with their peers or bringing this into their own work and artistic practice as they grow up in this, well, as we've all mentioned, all the various power structures of our world. A few sentences on any advice you might give to young people hoping to do this work or already doing it.
I'll go. I think find your peers. You know, it's really exhausting. It's really lonely sometimes. It's really frustrating. And especially for me as somebody who came in without, you know, qualifications or feeling like I'm able to participate in some particular ways that the movement exists, or some of the particular kind of narratives of what a protest should or shouldn't be like. And the most useful thing that I found was finding my peers who exist in a space away from that, where it's safe and nourishing, and we can dream in the ways that we want to dream and need to dream, and look into what it really means to you, and take that energy, and don't be afraid to shout about it, as long as you're safe and protected and nourished.
Thanks, Farah. Would anyone else like to add any more advice?
I just say something about how I found XR and and the kind of, it's a very democratic organisation which is very, I feel, even though it has flaws and it's working on them, especially in its constituency, it's a largely white organisation. But having said that, it wants to change, and it's very democratic. It always says, you know, please listen to the quieter voices. That's one of the things they said in the meeting, because, you know, some people feel very unable to talk, and some people don't have that, you know, are quiet. Please listen to people. I mean, that's just one of the things, and I felt so thrilled to be part of something that's trying to be democratic, and it's made me think that we don't live in a world that's truly democratic, that really asks of us our opinions and what we. So I mean, I'm just offering that up if anybody wants it, if you want to explore that, for example, as a bigger movement which breaks into little groups and is trying to truly be democratic and enabling.
Yeah, I would follow that by just giving a really clear signpost to there is a date in the diary coming up for XR, but it's more than XR. It's a real movement of movements, design of action that's happening, where Fridays for Future's involved. There's a big carnival-esque element because it's the bank holiday weekend of August. So there is a rebellion coming up, but it's going to be quite a different kind of rebellion, and its success will be dependent upon those who are involved and feel drawn to it. So have a look on, I think it's rebellion.earth, to see how that speaks to you, and to find your local groups, or to make one, you know, take the power into your own hands. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. Yeah, Berlin's coming up. It'll be interesting. Really, really good thing to be a part of. Another thing that's probably great. I don't know if it's advice. It's not really advice, is it? Oh, maybe I shouldn't say it. But just you're okay. If I was speaking directly, I would say, to quote K. Michael, who once said to me, "Activism is swift. Activism is fast. Activism is light on its feet." And in those moments of lightness, often we are going, well, my voice isn't important. I'm not sure that I really know what's going on. Here's the thing, the science is really quite difficult, actually, when you look into it, when you look at like actual workings of tipping points and different papers that contradict each other, it's very difficult. What isn't difficult is the government's failure. The government has significantly failed us consistently. There is no, oh, they did do this, no, they have. And actually, your against that and your voice against that is important. Your viewpoint, your background, your heritage is important. You're working with other people, with your community, with your friends, changing the conversation around the dinner table all the time is important. Your voice is important. You are important. Be part of that conversation. That's what I'd say.
Yeah.
I think that is an incredible point for us to end this conversation. Thank you so much to everybody on our panel, and thank you to everybody joining us in the audience. This festival is still ongoing. Please do listen to the new audio drama As Waters Rise, which is on the Almeida's SoundCloud channel and also the Almeida's website. Coming up at 2:30, we have a film screening of the short film Extinction and a Q&A after, so join us for that. And there are also resources, recommendations, artworks and films available on the Shifting Tides area of the website, so please do have a look. Thank you so much again, and goodbye. Have a lovely afternoon.